Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm Mickey Huff with Eleanor Goldfield. Today, in this segment, Eleanor and I are getting together to continue a long line of our conversations, sort of roughly around a theme: is this the best we can do? Where we'd been looking at uh, the first year of the Trump administration, people that were in public office, appointed to office, etc., and asking basic questions about their overall aptitude for the positions to which they've been appointed. That's, of course, expanded, of course, beyond just the Trump administration and looking at the way media cover our events. And of course, we're also in the wave of a massive tsunami of AI, or artificial intelligence slop, that's taken over much of the internet. More than half of the activity on the internet now, according to numerous studies, is bot generated or fake. It's not from a real person, right? And so that's something to seriously consider. And so something that Eleanor and I have been doing more recently too, as you'll notice, those of you that listen regularly, is return to Project Censored's roots for the 50th anniversary. And Eleanor's been talking a lot about the news that doesn't make the news and why. So that's been another segment that we've been talking about. And Eleanor's been covering those materials, our social media outlets, platforms. We've been covering a lot of those kind of stories too. And what we're going to do in today's segment is we're going to, I don't know, almost merge a couple of these things together, but we're going to be talking about it through the lens of critical media literacy education. And the purpose of our talking about some of the things that we're going to discuss today isn't just, oh my, how absurd, or look how terrible, or why didn't we know this? But it's also, what can we do about these things? And who are some people and organizations that are doing something about these things? Because, Eleanor, it's becoming harder and harder to tell. Even with trusted outlets, it's harder and harder to tell what's real from fake. And we've had a number of situations happening in just in recent history in the last month that have reminded us the extent and breadth of the crisis, the epistemic crisis we're facing here in the post-truth world, I suppose. But also, we can kick things off, I guess, with an example so absurd from corporate media, not about AI, but about no I. Or contextless intelligence, right? Or from CNN, who seems to exist in an historic vacuum somewhere. So we wanted to start off with something that might at least get a sad chuckle from you all. And it's a perfect example how the corporate media frame information and basically create fake news out of whole cloth, all while sounding very serious and legitimate and talking about important affairs. And the first thing you wanted to talk to us about, Eleanor, was about CNN's coverage of Maduro in Venezuela. And our friend, the media scholar Alan McLeod, does a really clever job often of deconstructing headlines and articles. What have we here before us, Eleanor, for our first exhibit today?
Yes, Mickey, I think a sad chuckle is perhaps the best we can expect in these times, but a sad chuckle certainly was generated for me. Alan McLeod does amazing work. Folks can follow him on the platforms. He's also been a guest on the show and has worked with Project Censored in other capacities before. And this is a CNN article uh, that, quote, for years, Maduro cast the CIA as a convenient boogeyman, repeatedly accusing the agency without evidence of attempting to topple his regime as he clung to power. Now, the CIA has helped supplant Maduro and is poised to help actively manage the Trump administration's dealing with Venezuela's new leadership, end quote. Okay, so somebody like and as somebody who knows like how newsrooms with way less money work, I can guarantee you that this had to go through several people, like several pairs of eyes and supposedly several brains. And somebody's read this and said, okay, so Maduro's paranoid for thinking the CIA is after him. Also, the CIA is after him, and had no problem with that, like literally right next to each other. I didn't skip in the article. You can see it's right after. And I like it is just it is it's so bad, it's good. It is like the perfect example of how corporate media just I like it almost it's breathtaking. And I am almost without words because it's so amazing. And I mean, bless Alan for reading through this slop
Yeah.
to bring it to our
And
attention.
this is allegedly real human slop here. We'll get to AI problems
Uh-huh.
later. But this is why I was
Yeah.
saying about the no intelligence. I mean, this is worse than
Mhm.
that. They're clearly intelligent. CNN knows what they're doing, right? As you mentioned, this can't be an accident, right? This, you don't see this level of incompetence at high school newspapers, you know. And Alan, we'll just say Alan himself put it, quote, "The level of cognitive dissonance and imperial brain rot you must have to write this and then have it read by an editor and published is truly breathtaking." We could not agree with you more, Alan. And unfortunately, these examples are all over the place, particularly around these kinds of issues where the U.S. empire has a real stake in catapulting the propaganda, to borrow a phrase from George W. Bush from back in the day, right? When he was talking about the job of the president is to, he says, quote, "You see, in my line of work, you've got to repeat things over and over again for the truth to sink in, to kind of catapult the propaganda." And of course, Bush, that's him saying the quiet part out loud into a microphone. And that's exactly what we see around issues around Venezuela. It's what we see in Gaza. It's what we see for years around Ukraine in the Western press. It's riveting how otherwise, allegedly towering institutions of journalism get things so comically and ritually wrong, Eleanor.
Yeah, absolutely. And also this you mentioning the corporate media and this whole rigmarole reminded me of something. There was an op-ed in the New York Times just yesterday, I believe, that was commenting on the fact that the 5-year-old who ICE kidnapped and sent to a detention center along with his father was released. And it was an op-ed basically saying that he's one of many children who are in ICE detention centers and we should release them all. And that's a fine op-ed. Like, I agree with that. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't go to further, it doesn't go into deeper layers. Like, why are we kidnapping children in the first place? Like, why do we have detention centers that are predicated on the idea of separating families and putting kids in cages? Like, why is that a thing? Also, why is ICE a thing? And it's been around since only 2003, yet the framing is such that we consider it to be something that's been around forever, like sparklers on 4th of July. Like, we just accept it. And that's the thing. It's like, even when corporate media, and this is not, this is not the New York Times editorial board, this was an op-ed, so it's even less attached to the New York Times entity, really. But they wouldn't, the New York Times would not publish an op-ed, very likely, that would say something that goes deeper into these questions. Like, can we trace back putting kids in cages? Oh, is that something that the US has done before? Whether that's, Japanese internment camps or indigenous boarding schools or what have you. Like, can we contextualize this? No, we're just going to have this kind of nice tagline that says that kids shouldn't be in cages, as if it's like this radical progressive idea, when in reality, it's like, that should just not even be a thing that we should have to say. Like, that shouldn't even.
We've got to do amazing, mental gymnastics and euphemistic language in order to coast over just the obviously inhumane, illegal, treaty violating kind of behaviors that are going on here, not just according to the US Constitution, but international law, both domestically and overseas, in a lot of ways. And Eleanor, another example of some things that you wanted to bring up around some of the erroneous information that's being spread around. I guess that's a charitable euphemistic phrase too, huh? Sometimes we might be able to say things like lying, although that gets into more legally precarious territory. But again, to suggest that CNN isn't aware that they're having two paragraphs completely contradict each other right next to each other, and all the editors and writers and people miss that, I don't think so. Right. And again, there's almost a cynicism behind it that, well, the American public is so distracted and stupid and ignorant and so forth that Team Red and Blue will believe whatever they do, and CNN's the most trusted name in news. And again, this is a great disservice to the public sector. And this is, of course, another contributor as to why the establishment press has such low polling numbers when it comes to things like public trust. We just saw a whole month, unfortunately, in the last several weeks of the way the media frame these ICE attacks against people in Minneapolis and the murdering of two people in particular. And of course, there's many others that have been killed by ICE over the last year. not to mention people being snagged off the streets, U.S. citizens thrown in what we could call concentration camps. We call them detention centers, as if it's like some kind of adjunct to the retirement home next to the old Kmart plaza or something. I mean, just the banal nature of it is so remarkable in that regard. But you also wanted to talk about some stories in Gaza, Rafah,
Mhm.
and a few other things. Eleanor, go ahead and maybe shift gears for us and talk a little bit about some of what's been on your mind regarding those issues.
Yeah, I mean, as you pointed out, Mickey, they could be called concentration camps, but it's the use of language to to beautify, to make things, to whitewash them, to smooth them over, to make them seem less offensive, right? If every time we referred to a detention center as a concentration camp, what would that do to people and their rage about the issue, their activation on an issue? And so, for instance, just yesterday, we're recording this on Monday, February 2nd, for folks, so folks are aware. Yesterday, the corporate media ran with the story that the crossing from Gaza to Rafah is open. Now, with one in particular that I is just amazing. It says, with Rafah open, could Hamas run health ministry be replaced now? As if those two are related. Also, the Hamas-run health ministry is a fascinating way of putting that. It's like if you said like the Trump-run CDC. It's like the framing of that is like, wait, what? Why would you put it that way? And yet, what I really wanted to focus on was the word open, because if I asked listeners to think of a open door, what would you think of? I'm assuming you wouldn't be thinking about barbed wire and armed guards and a surveillance network that would make Orwell blush. No, you'd think of an open door. But the problem is that the Gaza the crossing between Gaza and Rafah is not, or the Rafah crossing is not open in any sense of the word that open means. What really happened, this is part of the quote unquote ceasefire, another word that has no place in what's been going on in Gaza since October 11th, which is when the quote unquote ceasefire went into effect, where more than 500 people have been murdered by Israel. So basically, it's a checkpoint, which also sounds kind of banal. Oh, a checkpoint. How lovely. Oh, the TSA checkpoint. That sounds fine. I just, take my shoes off and I
Other
put them in a little
historic
pocket.
checkpoints may be a little different.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like this is more like the like the Berlin Wall checkpoint, right? Um but basically, under the new arrangement of this opening, is that 50 Palestinians will be allowed to enter Gaza from Egypt every day, while approximately 150 Palestinians will be allowed to leave. And there's no indication of whether that would be something that they can go back and forth, right? Like, so maybe if somebody can leave to get medical attention, can they go back? Right? That's not being answered. Also, you have to get prior approval from both Egypt and Israel, which prior approval is not a matter of just like going to an office, which, by the way, what office where, when your entire home is has been bombed, to leveled. So that, like, what is that process like? It could also cost thousands of dollars, which, the average American doesn't have thousands of dollars. Imagine how much less the average Gazan has after more than 2 years of a genocide, when in fact, just to begin with, they didn't have financial stability. So the intense hoops one must jump through in order to access this open crossing is absurd. So to call it open, and to call it as, like, to say that this is really like living up to the ceasefire agreement to open this crossing is absurd, and it's journalistic malpractice to parrot what Israeli forces and what the Israeli government is saying when they say this is open, because this is really just what, again, this is part of that concentration camp lifestyle that has been forced upon Gazans and is ramping up on Gazans, uh, because this is not open. This is a violent bordered checkpoint that is in line with concentration camps, not with an open crossing.
Well, and flipping that in another direction in a similar way about the distortion of language and so forth. BBC, recently was talking about to their reporters not to call the abduction of Maduro a kidnapping, right? So, just I mean, again, so if you're not going to call that a kidnapping, how can you continue to call what's happening in Israel Gaza a ceasefire? It's not a ceasefire. They're continued attacks by by the day, killing more innocent civilians many times. Additionally, really quick before we cut to break, at least acknowledge that the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, recently acknowledged that the Gaza Ministry of Health, which was the evil propaganda arm, most evil propaganda arm in history, according to Western media, this past year and a half or so, they now concede that more than 70,000 Gazans have been killed, and some put the numbers over 73,000. People like Ralph Nader have actually put it at hundreds of thousands of people. And the Western press, the corporate media, don't address that issue at all, much like they took forever to discuss how many people died in Iraq. When we were covering that issue 17 years ago, the AP was reporting that 78,000 people died when the number was over 1 million people, and 4 to 5 million refugees. Dar Jamal was covering that years ago, and so on. So the challenges and the problems we're discussing here too, Eleanor, aren't new. These are just current ramifications of them. But now we have added challenges with AI, slop, fake images, deep fakes, and so on to discuss. And I know we're going to come back and talk not only about some of those things, but what we can do and are doing about it. Some of the language that's used, the euphemistic language, the purposeful obfuscation. Another tactic of the press is like, well, it's always been that way, right? Whenever they have finally come around to seeing, well, I guess you were right that we were killing a lot of these people. Who would have known? Again, Redux, we talked a little about Iraq. You could go back to Vietnam. Rarely do you hear anyone talk about the 3 million plus Vietnamese that died as a result of that disastrous effort, that disastrous incursion of the U.S. military into Southeast Asia that lasted from the 50s to the mid 70s. We could go on and on with those. In the times in which the U.S. is intervened in other countries, and we don't hear about the thousands or way more people that are killed. Panama comes to mind, Operation Just Cause, 1989. We rarely heard about the several thousand people that died in the outside in the barrios of Panama City. I'll never forget the late great Michael Parenti, and nod to Michael Parenti, who just passed away recently at 92. Michael Parenti was a longtime Project Censored judge, wrote a great foreword for our 20th anniversary book. I had an opportunity to do some great work with Michael over the years in talks in Berkeley and other places. Michael was one of the few and early people that called that out by talking about media framing and who's a worthy and unworthy victim, which is back to Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. So the idea is the tools of media literacy have been before us for a while. Project Censored's been around 50 years. Eleanor, maybe we should talk a little bit about some of the things we can do about these challenges. And you and I, when we were talking before, and maybe you want to share this with our listeners, fake news, deep fakes, photographs, etc., that aren't accurate. This isn't just something that's a problem in corporate media or random social media platforms and TikTok and stuff like that. You and I were talking before that even trusted outlets, independent outlets, progressive outlets, anybody, even if they're really keen on trying to find the truth, make mistakes and can promote false narratives, false images, and it's very difficult. So I know that we were also talking before that in our country, nuance is a corpse, right? And that we keep beating it, seemingly, that we can't seem to walk and chew gum at the same time, even though we're clearly capable of doing both. Can you talk to us, Eleanor, a little bit about the pitfalls of these things and how might we address them? You actually put together a great resource, a critical media literacy for activists resource that's available for free at the projectcensored.org site. Ways in which that we can be more informed and active, and people who are advocacy journalists might take heed in terms of how they act in that space when they're being the media. Eleanor Goldfield.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. And I want to start by saying that I think we're all susceptible. Like, so I this is not I want to make clear to listeners that I'm not sharing this as like, ha ha, gotcha, and I'm smarter than you are. Like, we are all susceptible to this kind of confirmation bias, right? Like, you see a video that confirms something that you felt or thought, and you're like, oh, I gotta share that because this is so spot on. And part of that analytical mind, that critical mind, kind of deadens a bit when you really want something to be true, right? And so I think it's really important to recognize that we're all susceptible to that, and like that we need to take that moment, like that pause right before we go ahead and, pull that trigger and share it or post it, that hold on, is this like accurate or do I just really want it to be? So for instance, over the weekend, I was noticing that this independent media outlet was getting dragged a bit on social media because they had posted what uh, ended up clearly being an AI generated video of ICE kidnapping parents at a school pickup. And it was it was one of those things where I started watching it and I was like, "Yeah, this is horrific." And then you start noticing some things, like all of the ICE agents are dressed the same, which if you're not aware, they're not dressed the same, and they're hardly ever wearing something that identifies who they are, which is kind of the problem. But in this video, they all were. They all had the same haircut. They were wearing short sleeves, even though they're supposedly in Michigan in January, which that's like -20. So nobody's wearing short sleeves. I don't care how Rambo you think you are, you're not. Um, there were random close-ups that wouldn't make sense with any kind of camera equipment, like a dashboard cam all of a sudden has a tight close-up. There were other similar clothing issues, and I can go through like some of the tips for noticing AI generated video, but this was one of those moments where it was like, oh, you just really wanted this to be true because it lines up with the kind of, the anti-ICE, like the importance of documenting their crimes and things like that. And so you shared this video without doing some of that important analysis, that critical media literacy that would have told you, hold on.
Yeah, don't click like share. There's an important part that goes between the click like share. It's click, read, think critically and engage, slow down, corroborate, check other sources. As you mentioned, look for telltale signs of AI sloppery, right? Like you had just mentioned several, and just when you're contextually thinking about what you're seeing, right, versus what reality might suggest. And look, here's the other big wow moment. There actually is footage of these there are examples of these things happening where people are being ripped out of cars, and ICE agents are waiting for people at schools. So we don't need to be promoting false evidence of this when you might actually have examples of real evidence to do it. And pointing it out to people when they're spreading it isn't like you suggested, a gotcha. It's, hey, let's slow down and be careful that we don't tarnish our own reputations in the process of sharing important information. Right. And this is how you kind of poison the well. And then if one person gets, oh, that was a fake image, even if you could produce 10 other examples of it really happening, people will stick to the one time it was fake and you can never convince them. Right.
Right, and this is that nuance that you talked about, Mickey, because it's like I still go to this outlet because they do good work on other things, but that's the thing, it's like we can never no outlet is 100% perfect and
No,
100% bad, right? The New York Times will sometimes have a really good op-ed or sometimes
absolutely.
have good reporting on something, and, independent alternative outlets will mess up,
Yes.
and they will share something that's inaccurate, or they will have to issue a correction or something. And I will say that I feel personally that independent alternative outlets do a better job of issuing corrections than the major
Oftentimes.
corporate outlets.
Yeah.
But I think that that's important to recognize that we're all fallible and we shouldn't cancel a journalist or cancel an outlet because they make a mistake. Now, if we start recognizing a sort of repetitive nature of these mistakes that start to feel purposeful and obfuscating things or omitting things on purpose, that's a different story. But if somebody makes a genuine mistake, I don't think we should cancel them because that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the media landscape. It doesn't help us be more critically media literate because it just suggests that if anybody makes a mistake, we can't look at their content anymore. And then their important reporting on other issues or other stories will go unaddressed or unviewed or unread. And that's not what we're looking for, right? And it really speaks to the fact that we have to have this critical media lens all the time. We can't say, "Oh, just because I like this outlet, I no longer need to be critically
No,
media
no,
literate."
no.
It's
The
not like
opposite.
distilled glasses you just put on every now and then. Like, that needs to be there all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It needs to be there all the time. And we need to help each other do it, show grace and patience with people, not automatically start calling people agents or moles or bots or dupes or whatever the nonsense. The left is great at getting into circular firing squads, right? And again, confirmation bias really contributes to the ready, fire, aim problem that we see a lot of people who are very passionate about certain topics. Really important that the critical media literacy asks us to slow down and interrogate. And it's very important to question our own assumptions first, I believe, not just outwardly, but like, what am I doing, and how can I prevent myself from contributing to the mis and dis and malinformation problems that are around us? And of course, one of the resources is a critical media literacy for activists guide that you have available. It's at the projectcensored.org site I mentioned before. And there are several other, by the way, at the Project Censored site, we have a lot of free resources on media literacy in the classroom, and they're free. And, we want people to go and use those if it helps them think more critically about the media. We've been doing this for half a century now, for better and worse, right? Wish we didn't have to. Eleanor, this will air next week, but you and I are talking, as you mentioned earlier, on February 2nd, Groundhog Day, also Groundhog Day. And, you mentioned things about patterns in media outlets. And right, the pattern we see in a lot of independent outlets is when they get things wrong, they try to correct them and they try to cop to it. And oftentimes when we see the major outlets getting something wrong, they bury it or they obfuscate it or they try to both sides it. And so that contributes to declining public trust, right? So that our Groundhog Day riff there is, the CNN sounds the same about Venezuela for the last 25 years. The New York Times sounds the same on a lot of the conflicts we've seen in the Middle East for decades. That's something that critical media literacy helps break down, because historical context is necessary to help provide depth to the analysis we have. Because as you said, it's not just a one-off. Right, wrong, fake, real. It's building the pattern, the consistency, and developing a sense of trust with sources over time. And media literacy efforts really promote that. And by the way, this week of February 2nd, and this will air next week, so it'll be last week by then, is News Literacy Week. It's a national week that's sponsored by the News Literacy Project that does a lot of great work around this. And I want to make sure that folks know that there are great resources to go and become more media literate around the news, critically media literate, particularly projectlooksharp.org out of Ithaca College. Cindy Scheib, Chris Sperry do amazing work. They've got all kinds of lessons available to teachers for free from K-12 through college. Our good friends Nolan Higdon and Allison Butler, along with Sydney Sullivan and Tyler Poisson, did a whole guide on teaching critical AI literacy, tools and strategies for the classroom. You can find it Nolan Higdon's Substack. He's a regular guest here. We also have media literacy organizations listed at parkindymedia.org, as well as the Project Censored site. And again, Eleanor, you might want to take a moment here, as we're running out of time in this segment, but you might want to take a minute to talk about the piece that you put together in traditional zine format that's actually really useful to understand the importance of media, how to resist propaganda, engage with media strategically, how to maybe better be the media and develop trust among audiences. So anything you'd like to share with our audiences here in our last minute, Eleanor?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, these are trainings that I actually do both for organizers and for journalists, because I think it's important that we build those bridges more, because I think there's mistrust on both sides of that. Media tends to be a little afraid of the frontline organizers, and frontline organizers tend to not trust a lot of media, because a lot of media tends to be really extractive, right? To just try to get the story. They don't care about the safety. And that's another thing that I wanted to bring up with the sharing of videos that aren't AI generated, particularly when it pertains to children and at-risk communities. posting a video that shows people's faces can be really, really dangerous at a time when ICE is looking to kidnap people kind of randomly. So if you are at a protest and there are community members there who are at risk and you're taking a video, get a basic app that blurs their faces. It's like you can get them for free, right? It won't cost you anything, and it could actually save people's lives. Like, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic here, but we have to be more careful both as journalists and as community members when we're sharing this kind of information. And this is something that I tell journalists too. Make it clear to the people that you're speaking with that you are willing and able to protect them if that's something that is a prerequisite for them sharing their story. Because if the most important thing is that we get these stories out there because they're not covered, they're silenced, they're omitted in corporate media, then we owe it to the people who are sharing their stories to make sure that they feel safe enough to share them. And that's something that I think is really important. On the other side, though, it's important for organizers to not be afraid of media to the point that we don't engage with it, right? And I know some people will be like, well, forget it. They're just going to twist my words. Okay, well, then let's work on formulating a way that they can't, right? So that they can't break it apart and make it sound like this, Molotov cocktail throwing quote when you meant it a different way, right? Let's try to, and I say this as somebody who loves metaphors and I love myself some flowery language, but there's a time and a place for it, right? And maybe when the New York Times comes calling is not the time for nice metaphors. So being straight up, being very clear about what's on and off the record, being very clear about how this is going to be used. Are you using this for print? Am I being recorded? Because honestly, a lot of times they will be recording you without letting you know. Not every state has these laws that require somebody to tell you if they're recording you. So I think it's important to have these tools. And that's part of like media training for organizations is how do we talk to the media, understanding where that media comes from. Who is this source? What kind of coverage have they done in the past? This will also affect the language that you use. If some kind of right-wing outlet approaches me, I'm not going to use the same language that I might use if it's Unicorn Riot, right? Or like Electronic Intifada. I am going to
Right.
use language that I know, because here's the thing, I'm not going to just say no. I will say, okay, well, here are the parameters that will make it possible for me to speak to you, and then I'll use language that I would use on, uh, a Becky from Ohio or whatever, a Karen from
Context,
Ohio.
right? Context,
Right.
place, time, audience. These are all parts of critical media literacy education, communication, how we talk to one another, understanding the space, addressing known differences and finding commonality to get conversations
Mhm.
past an impasse, right? Those are all things that we teach. And actually, the course I'm teaching this semester is literally called Fighting Fake News, Press Freedom and Disinformation in a Post-Truth World. And so I'm talking about these things with my students every week, right? And they're finding examples and we're talking about them and we're trying to model the very kind of conversation you and I just had, Eleanor, really trying to model that in the classroom so that students will take that into the newsroom and out into society so that we have a generation of people thinking more critically, because we need critical media literacy now, maybe like never before. And those things are always trite and cliche sounding. But I wake up by the day and see these new developments and new changes and new ways to fool people based on old ideas. But the technologies have gotten so sophisticated that it's very hard even sometimes for well-intentioned people, right, to really figure out what's happening. And we kind of all get sucked into the noise, and then it creates this kind of cynical malaise where we can't believe anything anymore. And going back to the Orwell axiom, it was the party's final command to tell you not to believe your own eyes and ears. And we've seen that very literally just in the last month, right? And so we need to be ever vigilant. We need to be supportive of one another in our critical thinking skills. Of course, critical thinking is individual, but it's also collective, how we help each other think more critically about things without attacking each other. So, Eleanor, thanks so much for breaking down the great resource that you put together, the Critical Media Literacy Guide for Activists, the How-To Guide. Again, I had mentioned the Substack for Nolan Higdon, projectcensored.org, parkindymedia.org. Project Look Sharp is another fantastic organization. And of course, Frank Baker's Media Literacy Clearinghouse that I neglected to mention earlier. A lot of free resources online. No excuse for our listeners to be wandering around in the dark. So hopefully we help shine some light on that today, Eleanor.
Amen. And I just want to echo what you pointed out, Mickey, that that media should be a tool for bringing people together. It should not be a tool for burning bridges, but building them. And I think critical media literacy is part of it's a big part of that, because if we can acknowledge the nuance, if we can understand how to speak to one another and how to address these issues collectively, then I think we have a lot better chance at addressing the issues that we're all feeling and struggling with. So thank you, Mickey, for the work that you do, particularly in the classroom. And again, folks, check out those sources that he mentioned. And thanks for being here, and thanks for listening. And we'll see you all next time.